A whistle cut through the mist, then came the splash, sharp and final, swallowed by the Rhine's black surface. On the near bank, hooded lamps threw narrow cones of light onto churned mud and wet planks. Engineers leaned into a rope that vibrated with current, hauling a lifeline net that bowed and snapped as it dragged against the water's force. The shoreline was not open ground. Military police had turned it into a corridor with rope lines, guiding bodies from the water line to a cramped triage point and then onward to a holding area. Men moved through in stages or not at all. Medics worked at the first choke point, deciding who needed warmth first. Beyond them, a lantern and a table waited for names, counts, and custody. It was late March 1945, during the Allied push across the Rhine. The riverbank ran like a machine under strain. Engineers owned the tools that kept people from drowning. MPs owned the boundaries that kept the bank from collapsing into a stampede. Medics owned the minutes that separated shock from survival. The net surged, dipped, then rose with weight. 2 engineers braced while a third guided the mesh toward the planks with a pike pole. When the burden broke the surface, a head appeared, hair plastered down, mouth opening and closing in reflex. The man was hauled onto the boards in one heavy slide, water pouring from his clothes. Staff Sergeant Rollins, leading the MP detail at the corridor's corner, stepped in before the crowd could press forward. He raised a palm to hold the line and set his boots wide for balance. The prisoner on the boards was not armed in any visible way, but Rawlings watched his hands anyway. A medic pushed in, reaching for the prisoner's wrist. Rawlings did not block the care. He controlled the movement. He caught the man's forearm with a steady grip and kept his shoulder against the plank so he could not roll and bolt into the dark. The prisoner flinched hard, eyes wide, breathing in short, ragged bursts that fogged the lamp beam. The medic tilted the man's chin into the light and cursed softly at the color of his lips. They began cutting a sleeve to check for wounds without stripping him bare in the wind. The prisoner tried to form words, but his jaw chattered too violently. A boatman's cap still clung to his head, and he stared past Rawlings toward the unseen river. Behind Rawlings, engineers were already reaching for the net. The lifeline net had to be back in the river in minutes. Another fall could happen without warning, and the current did not offer second chances. Rawlings saw the small canvas tag stitched to the net's corner, the only reliable way to tell one net from another when teams traded tools in darkness. He also saw the fatigue in the engineers' faces, the temptation to rip the net free and run. That was how gear vanished, and vanished gear meant people died later with no clear reason. Rawlings reached into his field jacket and pulled out a small camera wrapped in oilcloth. He motioned an MP with a clipboard to move closer under the poncho. The medic glanced at the camera and then back to the prisoner's face, impatient with any delay. The engineer corporal's eyes tightened. He wanted the net back in the water now. The prisoner saw the camera and jerked as if struck. His wet shoulder slid on the boards. He twisted, dragging the net corner with him, mesh scraping and catching on his boot. Panic made his movements sudden and clumsy, but it also made them dangerous. If he tangled the net or tore the tag, the tool would be compromised at the moment it was needed most. Rawlings tightened his hold and signaled 2 MPs. They stepped in, one taking the prisoner's other arm, the second bracing behind his hips to keep him from rolling away. The prisoner tried to crawl toward the darker edge beyond the rope line, fingers clawing at mud, then slipping. He was not strong. He was terrified and cold, and that mix could still disrupt the whole corridor. Rawlings kept the restraint procedural, no blows, no anger. Visible control, hands on joints, weight applied to prevent escape. then released the moment compliance returned. The medics continued their work as best they could, keeping their supplies out of kicking range. A blanket was draped over the prisoner's shoulders, wetting through immediately but cutting the wind. The engineer lifted the net tag into the lamp beam and held it still. Rollins took a photograph, then another, because a blurred image was as useless as none. The clipboard came closer. The MP wrote the identifier and a brief note, and Rollins added a time mark from his wristwatch. The engineer corporal hesitated when Rollins gestured for a mark on the log. The request was simple: acknowledge custody. Without it, the chain would be broken, and broken chains made people stop using tools when risk rose. The corporal leaned in and scratched his mark onto the damp paper. From upriver came a shout, then another, thin and urgent in the mist. The corridor behind Rollins pressed forward, men craning to see. Rollins snapped his head toward the sound, then back to the net and the prisoner. If someone was in the water again, the net had to move. If the net moved without trace, the next crisis would be worse. Rollins handed the clipboard back and waved the engineers on. They pulled the net free of the prisoner with care that was almost gentle, shaking out the corner to make sure the mesh had not snagged. They dragged it toward the water line, the rope humming as it took tension again. The net disappeared into the fog, ready to be thrown once more. As the net left, the prisoner fixed his gaze on it, not with gratitude, but with a fresh spike of alarm. He tried to lift his head and push himself upright. His muscles failed halfway, and he collapsed back, breath rasping. The medics did not pause. One held a cup to the prisoner's lips and controlled the sips so he would not choke. Another checked his feet, cutting a boot away and wrapping the pale skin in cloth. Their triage was blunt and humane at the same time, driven by the constraint of too many bodies and too little warmth. Rollins watched the rope line behind him and the dark gaps beyond it. He had seen prisoners vanish into darkness earlier in the campaign, and he had seen the wasted minutes that followed. He would not let this corridor become a place where people slipped through cracks just because everyone was busy. When the medics finished the first pass, Rollins signaled for transfer. 2 MPs lifted the prisoner by the upper arms and moved him along the inside of the cordon toward the holding area. It was not a cage, just a controlled patch of ground with fewer exits in a clear chain of custody. A lantern marked the table where a clerk waited with paper and pencil. Rollins delivered a clipped report that contained only what changed procedure: pulled from river, severe cold exposure, attempted to bolt at camera and equipment handling, restrained without injury, needs warming and monitoring, to be processed when capacity allows. The clerk wrote, turning a shivering body into an entry that could be tracked. The prisoner slumped onto a crate, wrapped in a blanket that steamed faintly near the lantern. His eyes kept returning to the path back to the water line, where the net's rope could be heard humming under load. Rollins stayed between him and that path, not to punish, but to keep the bank's machine from losing another part. Another whistle sounded, another splash followed, closer this time, and Rollins turned back toward the river, counting the corridor's limits and the net's availability, knowing that the photograph and the damp pencil mark might decide whether the next rescue happened in seconds or not at all. The holding pocket behind the rope line smelled of wet wool and river mud. Lantern light made every breath visible. A clerk kept a field ledger under a poncho, turning pages with careful fingers so the paper would not tear. Rollins stayed close to the table, positioned so he could see the corridor's choke point and the prisoner at the same time. The German boatman sat on a crate with a blanket around his shoulders. He was not bound, but 2 MPs stood close enough that any sudden move would meet a hand on his arm. His eyes kept returning to the dark gap where the corridor bent back toward the water line. He swallowed hard, and the motion made his jaw tremble. A medic passed through with a tin cup and a bundle of cloth. She made a quick assessment, then redirected her limited warmth toward another casualty whose skin had turned waxy. The boatman received only a tighter wrap and a brief check of pulse and breathing. The decision was practical and humane, and it also left him watching others receive what he wanted most. Engineers moved along the inside edge of the cordon toward the net station. One paused long enough to gesture toward the river, impatience made plain. Rollins acknowledged the gesture but did not abandon the table. The net had been photographed and logged, yet the river work did not wait for tidy paperwork, and every minute invited shortcuts. Upriver, a whistle sounded again, then a shout that drifted through fog and wind. The corridor reacted as a single body. Men leaned forward, pressing toward the water line, while MPs at the ropes widened their stance and pushed back with open palms. The flow slowed, then surged in pulses as people tried to see and medics tried to keep room for stretchers. A stretcher team forced its way past the holding pocket to move a casualty away from triage. The passage was narrow, and one MP had to step aside to avoid tangling with the stretcher poles. The gap lasted only a moment, but the prisoner reacted as if it were an exit. He rose and angled himself toward a cluster of men being redirected along the corridor. He did not sprint. He attempted to disappear, shoulders hunched, blanket slipping down his back as he tried to merge with moving bodies. Rollins stepped into his path and caught his elbow. The prisoner wrenched away and nearly collided with the stretcher's rear bearer. An MP seized his other arm and guided him back, turning the motion into a controlled pivot rather than a struggle. The grip tightened for seconds, then eased when the prisoner stopped pulling. The consequence hit the corridor immediately. MPs closed ranks at the holding pocket, narrowing the passage by a step to prevent a second attempt. The stretcher team had to angle wider, scraping a pole against a crate and losing time. At triage, the delay made the line invert. Those who needed to move forward were blocked by those who could not back up fast enough, and the medics' hand signals grew sharper as they tried to hold priority in a channel that no longer behaved. Rollins moved the prisoner deeper into the pocket, away from the corridor edge. Two MPs relocated the crate with a short lift rather than a drag, keeping the man's boots from sliding and turning the area into a hazard. The prisoner sagged as if the movement drained him, but his eyes stayed fixed on the ropes. The clerk kept writing through it all. He recorded the prisoner's capture status, condition, and custody chain with the same pencil strokes used for everyone else. The entries did not imply judgment. They established where the man was, who held him, and when. Downriver, raised voices carried over the water. Rollins left the table and moved along the inside of the cordon to the net station, staying within controlled ground. Lanterns marked a narrow work zone at the waterline where engineers handled the lifeline net and its rope. Two nets lay close together, nearly identical in the lamplight. Their corner tags were dark with water, and the numbers were hard to read under shifting glare. A corporal held up a tag and pointed at the clipboard entry from earlier. The figures did not match. Either the earlier reading had been wrong, or the wrong net had been logged, or the nets had been swapped during the last surge without anyone noticing. The engineers needed a net in the water. Their posture made the urgency unmistakable. Rollins did not contest the need. He contested the uncertainty. He signaled for both nets to be laid out, tags presented in sequence, and the rope ends compared. He required the discrepancy to be resolved, not explained away. One corporal pushed for immediate use based on assurance from his men. Rollins refused to authorize release on a verbal claim alone. Without a closed handoff, the tool's custody would be ambiguous at the moment it mattered most. Ambiguity produced hesitation later, and hesitation on a cold riverbank became lost time. A medic arrived at the edge of the net station and indicated a casualty that needed passage now. The corridor behind them was choking again. Rollins ordered one MP to widen the waterline gate by a single step and ordered another to hold the crowd back with firm, open-handed pressure. The change created a narrow lane for the stretcher, but it squeezed the net team closer to the river edge where footing was worse. In the tighter space, a net bundle was dragged a few feet to clear the stretcher. The movement was unplanned, and it shifted the net's expected position relative to the throwing point. For a moment, the corner tag disappeared under folded mesh. When it was lifted again, its ink looked smeared, the fabric darker, and the digit edges less distinct. Another whistle came sharper, followed by shouting that carried fear. The crowd pressed harder toward the waterline, not breaking the rope but loading it. MPs countered with bodies and rope, turning the surge into a slow, heavy pressure that stole room from everyone. The lantern bearer raised the lamp higher, washing out detail at the edges and making the tags even harder to read. Rollins forced the net problem back into observable checks. He had the rope ends inspected for knot patterns and wear, and he had the corporal identify which crew had last thrown which net. The relief corporal produced a crude knot marker near the rope end that corresponded to the net previously photographed. The tag, however, remained compromised by water and light. Plausibility was not closure. Rollins sent an MP back to retrieve the earlier clipboard and to locate the engineer who had held the tag steady for the photograph. He also required the corporal who had signed the earlier entry to confirm the identifier. Every messenger cost time, and every return trip had to fight the crowd. While Rollins worked the net station, commotion rose from the holding pocket. The prisoner had begun pulling at the blanket as if it were a restraint. An MP tried to press it back into place, and the prisoner slapped the hand away in a sharp, offended motion, then leaned forward as if preparing to stand again. Rollins saw the motion and made a decision that changed the man's options. The prisoner was no longer treated as a passive casualty, waiting for a warmer space. He was treated as a stability risk that had to be controlled before he could be advanced in the process. 2 MPs were reassigned to maintain close contact and prevent another attempt to blend into the corridor. The immediate effect was that he stayed in the colder pocket longer, and the medic's scarce attention shifted toward those who could be moved and warmed without resistance. The corridor narrowed, the triage line stuttered. The net station remained unresolved with 2 similar tools and 1 compromised tag under imperfect light. Rollins held position between river and cordon, waiting for the missing signatures and the earlier log to return, while the fog carried whistles and splashes that demanded an answer in minutes. The fog thickened as if the river were exhaling. At the water line, a lantern bobbed with every shove of the crowd against the rope. The net station sat in the narrowest gap between current and cordon, and the gap was shrinking. A whistle sounded from upriver, longer than the earlier bursts, followed by a shout that carried panic rather than instruction. Engineers at the edge leaned forward, searching the black water for a shape that might already be downstream. The rope in their hands was slack, and slack meant no net in the right place. Rollins kept his body between the river work and the press of men. He felt the rope line tighten under load, the cord biting into gloved hands as MPs held it. 2 nets lay on the planks, similar mesh, corner tags dark and smeared. The tool problem was not abstract, it was delay, measured in breaths and distance. The relief MP returned with the earlier clipboard shielded under a poncho, paper edges curled from damp. The entry from minutes ago showed an identifier, a time mark, and a signature scratched in hurried strokes. The number on the page did not settle the problem by itself because the tag now in the lamplight did not read cleanly. Rawlings sent one MP to the clerk for the camera and one to the engineer who had held the tag steady. The choice cost bodies at the rope line, so Rawlings replaced them with his own. He planted his boots, put a palm to the cord, and turned his shoulder into the pressure so the line would not bow inward. A splash erupted closer than before. The engineer corporal stepped toward the river with a net bundle ready to throw, regardless of paperwork. Rawlings did not grab him. He set a hand on the net rope and held it at the knot, a quiet stop that forced a look back. The corporal pointed toward the water and then toward the folded mesh, making the case that any net was better than none. Rawlings answered with a flat gesture toward the two bundles and the wet tag. If the wrong net went out and then vanished into confusion, the next rescue would not have a tool to reach for. Behind them, the holding pocket stirred. The German boatman, still wrapped in a soaked blanket, pushed up from his crate and fixed on the corridor bend where lanterns marked movement. He leaned forward, eyes locked on the gap at the rope line as if it were a root. An MP stepped in front of him and applied a steady palm to his chest, guiding him back without striking. The boatman slapped the hand away and tried to angle toward the cordon where bodies were pressing. The MP caught his elbow and turned him, keeping him inside the pocket, but the motion knocked a crate, and the crate skidded. The skid sent a metal cup clattering, and the sound pulled more eyes toward the pocket. The crowd read movement as opportunity. A few men surged, and the rope line flexed. MPs shifted to reinforce the cordon, narrowing the net station. Engineers lost space to lay out mesh. Medics lost a lane for stretchers. The bank tightened into one constraint that made every task harder. Rawlings made a decision that carried cost but prevented collapse. He ordered the waterline gate closed for a minute, a temporary seal that stopped new bodies from pushing into the net station. MPs crossed their arms and held ground, turning the corridor from flow into pause. The pause bought control at the price of speed. Triage behind them continued, but tempers rose. The engineer who had held the tag earlier arrived, hunched under spray and fog, and pointed at the left net bundle. He recognized the knot marker near the rope end, a short wrap his crew used as a tactile check. That narrowed the choice, but Rawlings still needed documentary closure. The MP returned with the camera, oilcloth peeled back. Rawlings verified the camera had been used, then brought the clipboard under the lamp. He required the engineer corporal who had signed the earlier entry to step forward and confirm the identifier with a fresh mark beside the first. The corporal complied, jaw tight, eyes still scanning upriver. The river answered again, a voice carried through fog with a call to throw. In the lamp beam, a dark shape broke the surface, then vanished. The current was giving them the price of delay. Rawlings chose the left net based on the knot marker and crew identification, then closed the last gap he could close on the bank. He held the corner tag under the lantern until the digits stood as cleanly as the light allowed. He took a final photograph of the tag in that light, then pressed the clipboard against a plank and wrote a second time mark with his own hand. The lifeline net's number had to be photographed before it vanished into the dark. He released the rope. Engineers moved with practiced economy. Two men ran the rope through gloved hands, paying it out in controlled length rather than dumping it. A third swung the net and threw it where the current would not drag it under the bank. The mesh hit the surface, spread, and then tightened as the rope took load. At the holding pocket, the boatman froze at the sound of rope humming and body shifting around procedure. He had been reading the camera as accusation, the pencil as judgment, the cordon as punishment. Now he watched the net leave the planks and understood a different chain. The photographs and marks were not about him. They were about the net, and the net was about the next body in the water. The realization did not soften his fear, but it redirected it. He stopped pushing toward the rope line and looked toward the river instead. His hands unclenched against the blanket, he lowered his shoulders and sat back down without being forced. The MPs holding him felt the change through his muscles and eased their pressure. A medic seized the opening. She stepped into the pocket and checked his breathing again, then directed that he be moved forward to the warming point as soon as the corridor reopened. Compliance changed his place in the machine. Rollins returned to the rope line the moment the net was stable. He ordered the gate reopened and the corridor restored, one controlled lane at a time. MPs widened their stance to absorb the first surge and then eased people through in small groups, keeping triage priority intact. The corridor flowed again without pushing bodies into the net station. The net rope vibrated as engineers hauled. The mesh caught something heavy and the rope went taut. Two men leaned back, boots slipping in mud, and a third braced a pole under the net to keep it from folding. A body came up with it, coughing water and grabbing at the mesh with hands that did not yet know they were safe. Medics advanced, and the corridor made room. A stretcher team moved through the reopened lane with less scraping and less delay. The bank was still strained, but it was operating. Rollins watched the net come ashore, then watched it be cleared, shaken, and prepared for the next throw. He saw the corner tag again, and now he knew which hands had signed for it and which time marks bracketed its use. That knowledge did not add warmth or light, but it added certainty, and certainty allowed speed without gambling. He turned back to the holding pocket and found the boatman waiting where he had been left, no longer angled toward escape. Two MPs lifted him by the arms, not dragging but guiding, and moved him into the controlled lane toward triage. The boatman went with them, head down, breathing, still ragged but no longer fighting the cordon. At the warming point, a medic replaced the soaked blanket with a drier one and pushed a cup into his hands. He sipped under supervision, shoulders shaking. Rollins remained nearby, not as a threat, but as the visible link between river work, medical work, and custody work. The corridor continued to run, and the net continued to move, tied to marks on paper and the steady hands that made them. The first pale change in the sky did not brighten the bank so much as thin the fog. Lanterns still defined the work zones, but the mist stopped feeling bottomless. After the last throw, the corridor held its shape. It had flexed under surges, sealed for a minute, then reopened in measured lanes. With the lifeline net back in rhythm, the shoreline stopped improvising and returned to repetition. Engineers reset their station 2 steps farther from the crowd. They laid the rope in a shallow curve so it would not kink when tension snapped tight. The chosen net was folded the same way each time, corner tag exposed, knot marker near the rope end kept clear of mud. A corporal assigned one man to hold the lamp at a fixed height so the tag could be read without glare, and another to wipe water from the tag before every check. Rollins watched the net station, then checked the corridor gate. MPs adjusted rope lines by inches, not feet, making a lane wide enough for a stretcher and narrow enough that bodies could not spill into the engineer workspace. The change altered tempo immediately. Triage moved forward in bursts instead of stalls. Engineers could throw without stepping around boots. The crowd still pressed, but it no longer owned the shoreline geometry. At the warming point, the German boatman sat under a dryer blanket, hands around a cup, shoulders still shaking. A medic had marked his condition with a quick tag and directed an MP to keep him seated until his breathing steadied. He complied. When he shifted, it was to follow pressure and guidance, not to reach darkness. The medics worked him with the same blunt economy they used on everyone. They checked his pulse again, checked his feet for sensation, and watched for confusion that would signal worsening exposure. They used actions rather than words. A fresh cloth wrapped his ankle. A dry cap replaced the wet one. The cup was refilled once he swallowed without coughing. Each choice was small, but each altered what could happen next. Rollins approached with the clerk from the ledger table. The clerk carried the book inside a poncho, pencil tied to a string so it could not vanish into mud. Rollins gave only what changed procedure. Prisoner recovered from the river, conditions stable enough for movement, no injury from restraint, custody continuous. The clerk wrote, then held the line up for verification. Rollins added a time mark and a confirming initial. The writing did not slow rescue. It kept the work from becoming untraceable. A stretcher team came through, and MPs opened the lane by half a step, then closed it again once the rear bearer passed. The adjustment kept the flow from turning into another surge. At the net station, the rope tightened again as engineers took load. The bank answered with a practice sequence: haul, clear, wipe the tag, log the time, return the net. The boatman watched the net when he could. Earlier, the camera had read to him as accusation and the cordon as punishment. Now he watched the net leave the planks and understood a different chain. The marks and photographs were about keeping a tool available for the next body in the water. The rules were not aimed at him, yet they contained him, and that containment now carried purpose. Rollins ordered the boatman moved to the processing lane. 2 MPs took him by the arms and guided him to his feet. Their grips controlled balance on slick boards. The boatman swayed once, then steadied, and they slowed their pace to match what his legs could do. The immediate effect was that he stayed upright and moving, reducing the chance of collapse and the demand on medic hands. They brought him to the lantern table where the corridor became record. The clerk used simple prompts and gestures. The boatman offered a few syllables, then stopped, jaw trembling. The clerk wrote what could be captured, marked unknowns plainly, and left space for later correction rather than forcing guesswork into permanence. Rollins verified the entry and indicated the next handoff point with an open palm, shifting the prisoner from the triage-adjacent pocket into a designated custody channel. The holding area for prisoners sat on slightly higher ground where mud gave way to packed earth. Rope lines defined its edges, and an MP post controlled the single exit. Prisoners were separated from casualties, moving to medical transport. The separation was enforced without cruelty. It prevented confusion that would produce mistakes in treatment and mistakes in custody. Rollins returned to the net station long enough to close the tool chain again. The clipboard now carried 2 time marks and 2 confirming marks for the chosen net. A short note described the knot marker used to identify it under poor visibility. The information was simple, but it created responsibility. If the net vanished, there would be a place to start looking and a name to ask. As dawn pushed closer, silhouettes on the far bank became faintly visible through thinning fog. The river remained dangerous, but the shoreline gained a small advantage. Fewer false signals and better depth cues. Engineers took advantage without relaxing. They kept the same checks. MPs kept the same rope geometry. Medics kept the same triage discipline, shifting warmth and attention toward those who could still be pulled back from the edge. A transport detail arrived beyond the mud line, and its presence changed the flow. Medics began labeling the most serious cases for immediate movement. MPs reoriented the corridor so stretchers could turn without crossing the prisoner lane. The change reduced collisions and reduced the temptation for anyone to break rope for a faster path. In the prisoner holding patch, the boatman sat with his blanket-wrapped tighter cup empty. An MP brought a replacement cup and guided him to drink slowly. He did so under observation. When his hands shook, he steadied them against his knees instead of flailing. His goal had started as escape. Under the weight of cold and control, it narrowed into survival through predictability. Rawlings walked the line once more, checking that each zone still matched its purpose. At the net station, engineers had rope ready and tag visible. At triage, medics had a clear lane and space to set down the next body without being stepped on. At the ledger table, pages could be matched to faces and times. At the prisoner patch, MPs held custody with posture and proximity, not with spectacle. Another rescue came in mid-morning light, and the net worked as it was meant to. Mesh caught, rope went tight, and men leaned back in unison, hauling a soaked figure to the planks. The tag was wiped, checked, and logged. The net returned to the water before the corridor could tighten again. Rawlings watched that cycle complete and then turned toward the prisoner patch. The boatman looked up as Rawlings approached, eyes still wary, but he did not rise or lunge. Rawlings directed the next transfer in the chain with a brief hand signal. 2 MPs guided the boatman toward a route that would take him away from the river and into established custody. He did not walk toward freedom, but he walked toward warmth and a process that no longer felt like a trap. Behind him, the shoreline kept working, tools returning to hands by name and time, and the river taking no more than it already had.